And welcome everyone to the Real Leaders podcast with keys from the keynote speakers here at the Agents of Change Summit. I'm your host, Kevin Edwards. Joining me today is Sam Quinones, the journalist and author of Dreamland. Sam, thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So Sam, what is your background in covering drug immigration?
Well, I've been a reporter 33 years now. What led me to write about is I lived in Mexico for 10 years. I was a freelance writer down there for a long time. I spent a lot of time writing about immigration back then, not so much about drug trafficking.
Okay.
But the two are very connected in a lot of ways. Then after 10 years doing that, I came back to the United States, came back to LA, which is kind of roughly my hometown. Got a job with the LA Times, and when I worked for the LA Times, they put me on a team of reporters that was covering the drug war out of Mexico. My job was to cover how drugs crossed the border and then where they went after they crossed the border specifically. And my first, one of my first stories, I began to focus on the rise in heroin trafficking. And I could not explain that because I thought heroin trafficking was, heroin was like this dead drug. Nobody really would want to use heroin again, right? I mean, after the 70s, people learned how awful it was. And yet you could see it was being seized in greater and greater quantities on the border by the DEA, and that meant that more people were using it in the United States. And so I couldn't understand that. And that got me into this whole story about our opioid epidemic. And I thought I was onto this fairly large story with this, with the heroin trafficking. But what I didn't understand, what I came to learn pretty quickly, was that all of that was due to a much bigger story, which was the transformation of pain management in America with opioid painkillers, and that massive prescribing of those painkillers for all manner of pain and in huge bottles and lots of refills, et cetera, created a new market because they're chemically chemical cousins to heroin. It created a whole new market for heroin. And so that began this whole process of trying to understand how we got to where we are with this epidemic.
Okay, so you're referring to the 2002 AMA, let's treat pain.
There's a fifth vital sign. There was a whole bunch. It started really in the 1990s, I think, with OxyContin, the arrival of OxyContin. But before that, even with pain specialists saying we are under-treating pain, we do a poor job of treating pain. The truth is, they weren't wrong. There was some truth to that. But they pushed this idea, joined by pharmaceutical companies, saying, yes, we need to do this. Not coincidentally, they were the ones who made those pills, so they want people to use more of them. And the key idea was that these pills are virtually non-addictive when used to treat pain. When you're a pain patient, you cannot get addictive. That was what was taught by pain specialists. It was taught in medical schools for a good long time. No longer.
Oh, really?
But that's how it became accepted dogma throughout the country, and that's why we had, beginning in the mid-1990s, you see this taking off of prescribing of pain pills, and the numbers rise every year, very, very high numbers every year for 15, 20 years.
The classic case is someone that hurts their back and has surgery and gets prescribed oxycodone or wisdom teeth, and then they love it so much, and then they get cut off and they move to the street heroin. So that is
that's definitely happened many times. Yes. There's more to it than that, though, I think.
Sure.
One thing is that so many people got prescribed so many pills. A lot of these pills ended up in medicine cabinets. People didn't throw these away, and they would get pilfered by the kids in the house or workers at the house. A lot of those pills ended up in the black market, even though the person may have taken only 2 or 3 of the bottle. That whole bottle might end up in the black market. And when you think of wisdom teeth, perfect example. Every year in America, according to the Dental Association, there's something like 5 million people get their wisdom teeth out. Well, for a lot of years, most of those folks, not everyone, but most of those folks were going home with big bottles of Percocets or Vicodin or Oxycodone or OxyContin. And a lot of that was just not used, or those people would either get addicted or they would not use all the pills, and frequently those pills would be just pilfered and end up in the black market. But whatever the case, all those pills that were being used were prescribed to somebody. Whether it was actually the person using them or not is another question.
Right. Yeah, and it's become quite the epidemic. I mean, I think what's so fascinating about it now is that not only do you see it in the black market, but you see it in kids in high school that
Sure.
are taking from their parents, and usually some of the drugs being laced with like fentanyl, and like fentanyl's a
Yeah.
you want
Right.
to
No, well, what I
elaborate
think
on
was
fentanyl?
what happened then is that this awakened the underworld, particularly the Mexican drug trafficking underworld,
Oh, okay.
to a new market that they really had not had written off largely. The heroin market up until that point, in the mid '90s, was really very, very small in the United States. It was not profitable. People in Mexico, people wanted to traffic cocaine. Marijuana, of course, always cocaine, sometimes methamphetamine, but heroin was, it's looked on as a very scuzzy drug in Mexico anyway, but there was no profit in it. And so what this did was create an enormous new population of people who were opiate addicted. And that meant the underworld of Mexico figured this out. And they began first trafficking heroin in every year more. That's what I was seeing when I got into this. Every year larger amounts, more seizures at the border, but that meant much more was getting in, and so people were using heroin. But then they figured out, actually, the real profit is in fentanyl. Fentanyl is a synthetic opiate, so you can make it in a lab.
Yeah.
You don't have to hire peasant farmers, you don't have to have land, depend on the weather, all of the very much less risk involved, and you can make it any time of the year, any day or night, whenever you want, so long as you have the chemicals to do so. And they began to realize that the profit margin too was spectacular, so much more potent than morphine or heroin is fentanyl, that you just make a very little amount and it was hugely profitable. So they began to figure out, oh, this is like the no-brainer for us. Wow, we'll just forget. So they began to traffic fentanyl here, illicit fentanyl made in these labs, made in kind of places that are not really pharmaceutical industry grade places, and traffic it here. And then people on the ground, the dealers on the ground frequently buy it to boost whatever else they have. If they have some heroin that's not very potent, put a little bit of fentanyl and boom. But if you want to get a good daily customer, put fentanyl in whatever it is you got, marijuana, methamphetamine. They'll get addicted to the opiates. They'll have to come back every day. If you are using methamphetamine, you can vary your use. Okay, I'm not going to use today. I used the last 5 days. I'm going to stop for a few days. You cannot do that with opiate. Opiate addiction is like relentless. It's every single day. And so if you add fentanyl to those drugs, you are creating, in a sense, an opiate addict. And that opiate addict has to return every day for his marijuana that is now laced with opiate, or methamphetamine, or cocaine. And that's why you're seeing also an enormous rise in the death toll, too. The deaths were very bad with the pills, when it was just pills. And then it got worse when it was heroin as a substitute. And then fentanyl has taken it up to stratospheric levels.
Right, because it's like 80 to 200 times more powerful or potent
Exactly,
than just
and so
heroin.
much more easy to smuggle too. That's the
Right.
other thing.
Really?
So a
How
little
so?
packet, like maybe the deck of cards or something like that, is a hugely profitable. You could put it anywhere, and the dogs generally
Jeez.
you can cover it up so the dogs can't smell it as well. There's all manner of reasons why it's a no-brainer for for traffickers of any kind to send this stuff. Plus, then what you begin to have on top of that is you begin to have local Americans here in the United States figure out that with the dark web, there are lots of companies in China that will sell them and mail it to them through the mail. So you have two sources really. Most of it's coming from China. It's coming from China.
Most of fentanyl is coming from China?
To Mexico, and
Oh,
they're
to Mexico.
doing it. Now the Mexicans are making it increasingly. Initially it was Chinese fentanyl coming over. But whatever the case, it's coming from China, being mailed in the U.S. mail to Americans here, who are then using it, mixing it with something and calling it heroin. Everyone now knows it's fentanyl. Or they're shipping it to Mexico, and Mexico is sending it up. Or they're they're shipping the chemicals to make fentanyl to Mexico, and then Mexico makes it. It's a complicated thing. It's all part of the global economy of the underworld, basically, is what's going on.
So Sam, we've all heard the stories about like El Chapo, the holes, the tunnels, the submarines. Right. What is the craziest story that you've heard about, and how are drugs getting across the border?
Well, I think one of the interesting things is this great debate over whether or not we need a border wall. To me, this is always very interesting because, first of all, it depends what you want a border wall for. A border wall can and has stopped people from crossing. You have much less illegal immigration coming from Mexico now. We're about 20 miles from the Mexico border right now, and there are two walls there. One wall starts in the ocean, 50 yards into the ocean, and goes for 14 miles, breaking for border crossings, legitimate border crossings. The other one is about 100 yards inland into the United States, and it goes for about 4 or 5 miles, the most populated areas of Tijuana. It's also got sensors on the ground, they got cameras, they got agents, dogs, all that kind of stuff. That has essentially stopped illegal immigration. That was one of the biggest.
Walls are working.
Right. Yeah. The biggest crossing on the entire 2,000-mile border was right down here. That doesn't happen anymore, and you can see that from the price. To cross now, it used to be like a movie ticket. Everybody pays the same price, $200. They take you into L.A. You're in a car with 40, 50 people, 20 people, whatever it is. They take you into L.A.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Now it's a boutique industry designing a crossing solution for you, and it costs $5,000, $10,000, $15,000, no longer $200, because the wall has made it impossible to mass migrate lots of illegal folks. At the same time, though, that those walls exist all along the border. There's a misnomer, the myth that there's no walls. There are walls all along the border, 700, 800 miles of border wall right now. At the same time, though, as the price for crossing has skyrocketed in the last 10 years or so, 15 years, the price of drugs has plummeted, and the potency has increased, and the prevalence, and that's because drugs come through walls.
Right.
They are trafficked in ingenious ways, in carburetors on people's bodies, and cans of chili, and whatever you can think of, literally almost whatever you can think of, they traffic it. And so to build a wall, in my opinion, is you need to know why you're building it. To build a wall to stop drug trafficking is, I think, a fool's errand. I think what stops drug trafficking, what best can stop drug trafficking is collaboration between governments. The same as if you'd have collaboration between one sheriff's department and another, and a police department over here, and you would never say, well, we'd never do that. We always want to fight this alone, you know. But that's how we do it with Mexico and the United States. We both governments have presidents who are not prone to collaborating with the other too much. I don't think. Seems that way anyway. We'll see. But I think that that you have to understand why you're building these walls. So I find this whole thing very interesting to watch as you see these debates. You can stop illegal immigration. You cannot really stop. We have not done any halting to the flow of drugs, and the price in both cases shows that that's the case. It's extraordinarily high now for crossing people. Okay. It's very, very cheap to get drugs into the United States.
So walls limit immigration, but not drugs. Okay.
If the walls limited drugs, we wouldn't have drugs in prisons and jails. Okay. And we do.
So when you mean the collaboration of governments, I guess one theory that pops
to fight this together. That's the only way, and it works. It does work. It's not very well publicized, but there are lots of cases where DEA and local folks in Mexico, where local authorities here collaborate to really put a stop to some of the more important drug trafficking. It needs to be far more extensive.
Well, there's always this debate about black markets and legalization,
right? You
know, driving consumer demand essentially. And there was an interview I saw actually with our president and the heads of the vape companies, the Juuls of the world, talking about kind of this problem. And his big fear was the black market. Do you have an opinion on the legalization of drugs and what that would do for the black markets and the shipping?
Well, it's a very complicated story, and I think I'm kind of going back and forth a little bit on this now. I do believe, though, that I used to think that demand spurred these things on. My feeling now is from the opioid epidemic, the clear lesson is that supply starts it. We did not have a massive raging population of opiate addicts before pharmaceutical companies began promoting the stuff, doctors began prescribing it, and the supply began to rise. And after every wisdom tooth extraction, you got huge amounts of dope to take home with you, and they get refills, et cetera. So we did not have this problem before there was this enormous new supply creating new demand. I understand it is absolutely true that illegal drugs usually create an underworld. We saw that with alcohol. We've seen that with illegal drugs. On the other hand, I have to say, nothing about American corporate capitalism gives me any kind of faith that they will be able to take newly legalized drugs and behave morally with them. Look, there's all kinds of other substances that are moderately addictive that they have refined to be extraordinarily addictive. Nicotine, social media apps, gambling, video games, sugar, on and on. There's a whole bunch of these things that American capitalism has said, we know how to market, we know how to refine these things so they are extraordinarily potent on the human brain, and we're going to entrust American corporate capitalism with methamphetamine?
Yeah.
Wow. I don't know. I don't know about that at all. With heroin, even less. You know, so to me it feels like I understand the feeling that we need to legalize stuff because it does create a black market. On the other hand, I'm not sure that we have a corporate capitalist marketing culture in this country that can be trusted to behave in any kind of ethical or moral way when it comes to drugs that they see are extraordinarily addictive, that the human brain responds to in powerful, powerful ways, and not use that opportunity to make them even more addictive.
So when you say this collaboration then, what are you proposing? Are they regulations on opiates? Are they an integrative approach to exposure, withdrawal symptoms?
Do you mean a collaboration with regard to Mexico?
To Mexico and the United States. You were talking about.
I think first of all we need to understand what's already working and just expand that. And there are lots of mid-level collaborations that are really working well. The president, to his credit, pressured Mexico to allow the Mexican Marines, the Navy, it's really called the Navy, to get involved in this drug fight. That's a very effective organization that the current president of Mexico decided should not be involved in the drug fight. That's a crazy idea. They were very, very good at their jobs, very sharp, very clean agency, and they were sidelined for the last year or so, something like that. Now, according to news reports, he said, okay, now we're going to get them more involved in the game again, and that's absolutely, all of this stuff needs to happen. We have these massive, in Mexico has these massive drug capos like Chapo Guzman and others that are bigger than Chapo that we don't really know, like Mayo Zambada, who's a partner of Chapo Guzman. Nobody really knows who this guy is because he wants to be quiet. He's down in Sinaloa too. He's a very, very, probably even more potent a figure than Chapo is. We have all these guys allowed to grow enormous into these oligarchs. That does not happen in the United States because we take these guys down.
Right.
We cut off the heads always. Does it mean that there will be no more? No, it doesn't. It doesn't. But it's part of criminal law enforcement. You know, I'm reading 2 books right now that are very interesting in this regard. One is a book called The 5 Families, about the 5 Italian mafia families of New York City. And the other is called El Traidor, which is called the Traitor, which is a book about the son of Mayo Zambada, who is arrested and is in American prison, and he wrote a diary, and it's about his diary and that kind of thing. In both cases, though, the lesson is, if you ignore these underworld figures and let them grow and just say, well, who cares, or they're just selling dope somewhere else, not here, whatever the case, that they will grow into extraordinary threats that they don't need to be, that they can be very easily nipped in the bud if you get them early enough.
Yeah, wow.
In the case of the Mexican traffickers, the Mexican government long ago was not doing anything. On the contrary, it was fomenting, it was encouraging these guys.
Jeez.
And it was part of the mix. Some elements of the Mexican government were part of the mix. They
Correct.
were getting the payoffs and so on. When it comes to the 5 families, the truth is very interesting as well. The FBI purposefully ignored the mafia.
Were they paying them under the table?
No, I think it was more that J. Edgar Hoover, early on in the life of the FBI, was afraid of taking on this organization, was more comfortable taking on Pretty Boy Floyd and the bank robbers, which needed to be taken on too, and that also thought that maybe his agents would be corrupted by this enormous organization, and also wanted to focus on communists and people with really almost no threat to the American people. Spent a lot of time investigating Martin Luther King, you know, and let those guys fester and fester and fester and grow. It wasn't until the 1980s when the FBI actually got involved and really, in a sustained, consistent way, attacking those guys. By then, they'd been in power. They'd been formed for 50 years. And so, to me, it feels like whenever you allow these guys to just go and do whatever they want, it is really not a good idea. Maybe politically feasible, maybe fine to say this, maybe you don't want to use the resources, but in the long run, it'll cost you more.
Well, that's what you're talking about. The supply starts it, and I think that's a really interesting point.
Yeah, and I think the heroin in New York City was all due to the Italian mob, and we did nothing to stop the Italian mob early on in their lives and for many, many years afterward.
You mentioned corruptness. You mentioned the United States cuts the heads off. What type of leadership is needed amongst the corporations as well as government and public officials?
Well, I mean, I think there needs to. I'm not sure. I mean, it's a big, broad question. I think corporate officials need to understand that many of them have created enormously addictive products already that are priming, that are creating addictive propensities in Americans. Again, with sugar, with nicotine, with alcohol, with gambling and video games and social media apps. I think those folks need to understand that they are part of a constellation. And Mexican drug traffickers, as much as we hate them and vilify them, they're right next to Mexican drug traffickers for what they've done with sugar, say, or alcohol, or nicotine. I think we need to understand, corporate officials need to understand their role in creating a propensity for addiction.
Interesting.
And marketing. Then, you know, Wendy's has an entire food line, food made to crave. Now sounds to me like a motto for the Sinaloa drug cartel.
No doubt.
You know, this is made to crave. You're going to crave our dope.
So, Tom, we talked about a lot today. We talked about the immigration, the wall, the drug use, the fentanyl, a lot. And then you wrapped it up kind of with leadership. So the last question I have for you is, Tom, what is your definition of a real leader?
Of a real leader? I suppose someone who understands through deep immersion in a topic or a business or an issue, understands that issue deeply, and understands when the truth of that issue is something that people don't want to hear and nevertheless says it anyway. I believe that you only come to that point through deep immersion. I've felt this on my own journalism. You don't get anywhere in understanding a particularly complicated topic without immersion. You have to immerse, and it has to be profound, you know, have to be constant. And when you get to immersion in it, then you understand what policies matter and what policies can work and what policies won't, and what policies, when you talk about them, sound good but don't really do anything, you know.
Definitely.
To me, that to me is a real leader. Somebody who says, this won't work, I know what will, it may, and then works towards making that idea politically viable, so that there's a constituency for it, convincing people, getting out there and say, we don't need this, we need this. Why do I think that? Because X, Y, Z, I've studied this, I've been involved in this, and we need to move this way. That is a real leader to me, but it all grows from I think, deep immersion in the topic.
Well, Tom, thanks for immersing our audience in the opioid epidemic today. I learned a ton from you. I appreciate your time and all your efforts that you do to make the world a better place. I'm Quinones. I'm Kevin Edwards, asking you to go out there, immerse yourselves, people, in something that you enjoy, form your own opinions, and always keep it real.